Hello and welcome to this episode of the Science Club Daily, and I'm joined today by Tina. Hello.
Hello, thank you, Ross. And today we are filming our first Science Club Daily in our fantastic new environment. What do you think?
I'm a big fan. I kind of like the little cityscape behind, and hopefully it gives that more like the visage of like daily life compared to, of course, the Science Club show, which has that very sort of
Classroom environment,
Yeah.
I do believe, is what we
Yeah.
were trying to go for. And now we have a little more of news and conversational environment. So
Yeah.
hope
Now,
you like it.
Speaking of the opposite of that, the sort of collaboration and collectivism of the show, today I actually have this story about slime mold, which might not sound interesting at first, but it turns out actually is really interesting. And weirdly, in this time of social isolation that we have going because of COVID, of course, kind of apt. And it's kind of how loners in a population might actually be good for the evolution of a species. So this species name, and I'm going to try really hard to say this, is Dictyostelium discordium. So
Is that even right?
Dictyostelium discordium, I
yes.
think.
I guess I know, in the spirit of being Australian, and we love summarizing things, let's
Yeah.
just call it
Dicky.
Dicky. Sure, let's just call it Dicky or Dicko. That's fine.
And essentially, this group from the University of Princeton were looking at how there are these weird examples of loners in slime mold. So to put it in a little bit of a kind of perspective, slime molds have this really weird behavior where if resources become scarce, they create these sort of mold towers. They
Right.
literally form into these structures of towers, and eventually what happens is an insect kind of grazes the top, taking a bit of the slime mold with it, and maybe what that does is it transfers some of the slime mold to a new environment that might have resources for the mold to grow. And it's kind of interesting because when we think about evolution, we kind of talk about survival of the fittest, but actually evolution isn't really about individuals surviving so much as it is the DNA.
Well, it's more about the survival of the species as a whole. Like,
Right,
it's
exactly.
the propagation of the species that is the
Exactly.
primary goal of reproduction in general.
Yeah.
So,
And so a lot of the time, that actually means that at a population level, a lot of a species, like a community, is willing to sacrifice itself just to make sure that at least part of its genome and therefore species can be propagated later on. And we see this with the slime molds. Only the molds at the very top will survive. And a lot of the time, most of the tower dies.
Right.
And obviously they don't get to continue. But there's this interesting thing that happens during this process where what seems random, but it turns out, spoiler alert, is not. Some of the slime molds, which are individual cells but do form these kind of organism-like colonies, they just kind of don't get involved. They just don't become part of the tower, and they kind of hang back. And the interesting thing with this is that this is actually a behavior that is seen in a lot of species. So a really great example that got brought up is that of, say, wildebeest. So a lot of the time, wildebeest are known for these massive migrations
yeah.
in huge herds.
Yeah, and I believe the most famous example was the one in Lion King, for example, where they all just sort of ran across the valley. And that's a real thing that happens from, so I heard.
Still too soon, but yes, great example. But yeah, essentially though, sometimes a little group of wildebeest, they just don't do it. They don't do the migration. They kind of stay where they are instead of sort of looking for food. And there's an interesting thing that can happen in wildebeest is that this rinderpest parasite can rip through a population.
Okay.
But because sometimes, for reasons we don't entirely understand, a small group doesn't move with the herd, they don't get rinderpest because they're not part of the group anymore.
Yep.
And they can sort of survive if the conditions there become favourable again. And that's kind of what they're thinking is the reason why some of these slime molds don't make these towers. That perhaps if a few of the slime molds stay back as these so-called loners, what happens is that if somehow the environment does change, they might be there ready to take advantage of it. Maybe it rains or a food source happens. It only takes a fortuitous bird dropping or like leaves falling and becoming compost or something.
Right.
Something for these molds to become sort of in the optimal environment. And the interesting thing is that these loners actually, they thought that they were random essentially because when this group looked at it to begin with, they were watching videos of this process and essentially it just looked like they were random loners. But what they did is they actually created some particular conditions, and depending on the environment and the size of the colony, it was only the mid-sized colonies when these loners were actually especially prevalent. So when there was a very large population, pretty much all of them turned into this tower if things got adverse. And they didn't really see these loner situations happening when there were smaller colonies. But when there were mid-sized colonies, they essentially found that they were more likely to form these sort of loner sort of colony, like not loner colonies, but just loners would hang back in that particular case, which for me is quite interesting because obviously that means that there is obviously some benefit in a mid-sized colony to sort of hedge your bets, as it were. So like in the smaller colonies, they just don't form the loners. They don't form towers. Sorry, they're just all the cells are kind of loners basically. And then I guess what happens is if they have a big colony, they're more likely to succeed in the tower. So everyone kind of, and by knowing, I mean chemical signals are kind of like quorum sensing in bacteria. A lot of organisms that can form into colonies produce chemicals that are like a language essentially. And when there's enough of them, they know they'll be successful in making the tower, so they all just kind of get on board. But when you have that middle situation, they hedge their bets. Some of them make the tower, some of them stay back. And I thought that was really interesting. And obviously, look, slime molds are just one example of this. And the reason they looked in slime molds is because they're very easy to study, being small. Obviously, you can't just do experiments on herds of wildebeest.
No.
But this behavior is really common. And also it's kind of interesting because humans have this as well, right? Like we always have the people who tend to just live a bit outside society, operate in a slightly different way. And there's a lot of arguments now that, these kind of neurodiverse people actually are really good for the evolution of the species because occasionally it provides you something that the actual population doesn't have, which I think is a really interesting way to look at it, this sort of idea of social bet hedging.
Yeah, and it's sort of Darwinian in a sense, right? Because the colonies, well, not colonies, the molds, they decide to isolate themselves because they are essentially left behind in what we would consider a harsh environment.
Right.
And as the Darwinian's law goes, the thing that can survive a harsh environment becomes the best version of its kind, essentially. Yeah. So, it's probably interesting to even look at potentially in the future in those mid-sized colonies because of the high density of those loners. Are those the better molds? Are they just, genetically superior to those in larger colonies, perhaps?
Well, the interesting thing is that the offspring of the loners weren't actually more likely to be loners themselves. So they were actually equally likely to kind of be team players or loners. So it seems that this entire process is completely decided by these chemical signals, and that perhaps if there's a certain density of cells, they all get the signal to sort of, make
form
the tower
or not.
But if these cells just happen to be just slightly far enough away from all of its neighbours, then maybe they do become loners. And so obviously we don't know what the long-term effect is yet on evolution because this is a relatively new finding. But if they keep kind of iterating on these molds, we may find some really interesting stuff and try and sort of apply that to other areas as well.
Yeah, that is fantastic. And I guess it's topical as well. So, stay at home and be a loner during the time of COVID-19 and you might just survive it, basically.
Yeah, you might kind of become...
it's a little rough, but the idea is applicable, I guess. Yeah.
But even just like socially, you may just find or discover something different and, kind of contribute that way. So thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of the Science Club Daily. I'm Ross Balch, of course, and I was joined by Tina. Please like and subscribe the video. It really helps us a lot to kind of get the signal out there for this kind of outreach that we're trying to do. And just after the video, there'll be a couple of other videos that you might enjoy as well.